The auction block in Yuma, Arizona stood in the blazing August sun of 1882, and Arabella Vance felt the wooden planks burning through the thin soles of her worn boots as rough hands positioned her for display before a crowd of unwashed miners, ranchers, and drifters who stared at her, with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. She had committed the unforgivable sin in her stepfather's eyes of reading too many books, of speaking her mind too freely, of teaching the neighbor children their letters when she should have been scrubbing floors. And now he was ridding himself of the burden she had become by selling her contract to whoever would pay enough to cover his gambling debts. The auctioneer, a portly man with tobacco-stained teeth, gestured toward her with his gavel. "This here is Miss Arabella Vance, 20 years old, healthy as a horse, and I am told she can read and write and do figures better than most schoolmarms. Her stepfather is offering a 5-year contract for domestic service to the highest bidder." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Arabella fought to keep her chin high even as humiliation scorched through her veins hotter than the desert air. She scanned the faces below, trying not to imagine what kind of man would purchase another human being's labor, what kind of life awaited her in some remote ranch house or mining camp where she would be entirely at someone's mercy. "Do I hear $50?" the auctioneer called. "50," came a gravelly voice from the back. "60," another man countered. Arabella's hands trembled despite her efforts to remain composed. Her stepfather stood off to the side, arms crossed, looking pleased with himself as the bidding continued. Her mother had died 3 years ago, leaving her at the mercy of this cruel man who saw her education not as an asset, but as a threat to his authority. $100, a new voice rang out, clear and firm, cutting through the other bids like a knife through butter. The crowd parted slightly, and Arabella's gaze landed on a tall man in his mid-20s, who stood with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to open spaces and hard work. He wore a battered hat that shaded his face, dusty denim pants, scuffed boots, and a dark vest over a shirt that had once been white. A bandana hung loose around his neck, and she could see the outline of a pistol at his hip. His face was sun-bronzed and angular, with a strong jaw that was set in determination. And when he lifted his eyes to meet hers, she was startled by their unusual color, a pale green that seemed almost luminous in the harsh sunlight. $100 to the cowboy, the auctioneer said with obvious satisfaction. "Do I hear 110? Silence fell over the crowd. $100 was more than most men made in 3 months of hard labor, and the other bidders clearly thought the cowboy was either wealthy or insane. "Going once," the auctioneer called. "Going twice. Sold to Vincent Foster for $100. Vincent Foster." Arabella committed the name to memory as her new owner approached the platform with measured steps. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of long days squinting into the sun, the calluses on his hands that marked him as a working man despite the small fortune he had just spent. He counted out the money to her stepfather without a word, his expression unreadable. "She is all yours," her stepfather said with undisguised relief. "And good riddance. Maybe you can beat some sense into her." Vincent's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to Arabella and spoke for the first time in her direction. "Miss Vance, I have a wagon waiting. If you have any belongings, you had best collect them now." His voice was deeper than she expected, with a slight roughness that suggested he spent more time talking to horses than people. She nodded mutely and stepped down from the platform on unsteady legs. Her stepfather had already turned away, pocketing the money without a backward glance. "I have a small bag at the boarding house," she managed to say. "We will stop there on our way out of town," Vincent said. He did not touch her or try to take her arm, but simply walked beside her through the dispersing crowd toward a sturdy wagon hitched to two bay horses. The animals were well cared for, their coats gleaming with health, their tack clean and properly maintained. It told her something about this man that his horses looked better fed than most of the people in Yuma. They rode in silence to the shabby boarding house, where Arabella had spent her last night before the auction. Vincent waited outside while she climbed the stairs to the cramped room she had shared with two other women and retrieved her single carpet bag, which contained everything she owned in the world: two spare dresses, some undergarments, a hairbrush, and most precious of all, the 5 books she had managed to hide from her stepfather over the years. When she emerged, Vincent took the bag from her without comment and secured it in the back of the wagon. Then he helped her up onto the seat, and she noticed that his hands were gentle despite their obvious strength, that he released her the moment she was steady. "Where are we going?" she asked as he clicked to the horses and they began moving through the dusty streets of Yuma. "My ranch. It is about 2 hours north of here, up in the foothills where there is more water and better grazing." "And what will you require of me?" The question came out more boldly than she intended, but she needed to know what kind of situation she was entering. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as they left the town behind and entered the vast emptiness of the Arizona territory. The landscape stretched in every direction, all sage-covered hills and rocky outcroppings, punctuated by the occasional saguaro cactus standing like a sentinel against the impossible blue sky. "I do not rightly know yet," he finally admitted. "I suppose you can help with cooking and cleaning. But mainly I want you to teach me." Arabella blinked in surprise. "Teach you what? Everything you know?" He glanced at her briefly, and there was something almost vulnerable in his expression. "I never learned to read properly. I can make out a few words here and there, enough to get by, but I cannot read a book or write much more than my name. When that auctioneer said you were educated, I thought maybe this was my chance to finally learn." Of all the things she had imagined her buyer might want from her, this had not been among them. She studied his profile as he drove, trying to reconcile the man who had just spent a small fortune to purchase her labor with this unexpected request. "You paid $100 for a teacher?" she asked carefully. "I paid $100 to get you away from that bastard who was selling you like livestock," Vincent said bluntly. "The teaching is what I am hoping you will be willing to do in exchange for a decent place to live and fair treatment." Something in Arabella's chest loosened slightly, though she remained wary. She had learned not to trust easily, especially not men who held power over her. "How do I know you will treat me fairly?" she asked. Vincent's hands tightened briefly on the reins. "I suppose you do not know that yet. I will have to prove it to you through my actions. But I give you my word that I will not raise a hand to you, and that you will be free to leave once your contract is fulfilled if that is your wish." 5 years is a long time," Arabella said quietly. "It is," Vincent agreed. "But maybe it will pass quicker if we both get something useful out of it." They fell into silence again as the wagon rolled northward. Arabella watched the landscape change gradually as they climbed in elevation. The air grew slightly cooler, and she could see green vegetation appearing in the draws and valleys where water collected. It was still harsh country, unforgiving to those who did not understand its rhythms, but there was a stark beauty to it that called to something in her soul. The sun was lowering toward the western horizon when Vincent finally pointed ahead. "There. That is home." Arabella followed his gesture and saw a collection of buildings nestled in a small valley between two rocky hills. There was a main house built of adobe with a covered porch, a barn that looked sturdy and well-maintained, several corrals, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, and she could see cattle grazing on the hillsides. "You have a nice spread," she observed. "It is mine, paid for with 10 years of hard work," Vincent said with quiet pride. "I started as a ranch hand when I was 15, saved every penny I could, and finally bought this land 3 years ago. The house is small, but it is solid. You will have your own room." As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, middle-aged with graying hair and a weathered face. He raised a hand in greeting, and Vincent pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Arabella Vance, this is Tom Fletcher, my foreman and the only other person who lives on the property full-time," Vincent said. "Tom, Miss Vance will be staying here and helping with the household." Tom's eyes were kind as he nodded to her. "Welcome, miss. It will be nice to have someone who can cook better than Vincent. I swear the man could burn water." Despite her anxiety, Arabella felt a small smile tug at her lips. Vincent shot Tom a mock glare but did not deny the accusation. "I will show you inside," Vincent said, climbing down from the wagon and coming around to help Arabella descend. His hand steadied her briefly, and again she noticed the careful way he touched her, as though she were something fragile that might break. The interior of the house was simple but clean. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall, a cast iron stove in the corner, a worn but serviceable table with 4 chairs, and a pair of old armchairs near the hearth. Doorways led to what she assumed were bedrooms. "That room there is mine," Vincent said, pointing to one door. "This one here will be yours. Tom sleeps in the bunkhouse most nights. There is a spring house out back where we keep things cool, and the privy is past the barn. It is not fancy, but it is comfortable enough." Arabella set down her carpetbag and looked around, trying to process the sudden change in her circumstances. Just this morning she had been facing an unknown future with dread, and now she stood in a ranch house with a man who seemed genuinely decent asking her to teach him to raid. "Why did you never learn?" she asked suddenly. Vincent leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "My parents died when I was young. Cholera took them both within a week of each other. I was 8 years old. I went to live with my uncle, who was a hard man who did not believe in schooling. He put me to work as soon as I was strong enough to hold a rope. By the time I was old enough to get away from him, I was too ashamed to admit I could not read and too busy trying to survive to figure out how to learn." There was no self-pity in his voice, only a matter-of-fact recounting of hardship that Arabella recognized all too well. She understood what it was to lose a parent, to be at the mercy of someone who did not value the things you held dear. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "It was a long time ago." Vincent straightened. "I will let you settle in. There is some stew left over from yesterday if you are hungry. I need to check on the cattle before dark, but I will be back in an hour or so." He disappeared through the front door, leaving Arabella alone in the house. She stood motionless for a moment, then slowly picked up her bag and carried it into the small bedroom. It contained a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin and pitcher, a small dresser, and a single window that looked out toward the hills. Compared to the boarding house in Yuma, it was a palace. Arabella unpacked her meager belongings, placing her dresses in the dresser and her books on top of it where she could see them. Then she washed her face and hands in the basin, tidying her dark hair as best she could without a proper mirror. When she felt somewhat presentable, she ventured back into the main room and investigated the stew Vincent had mentioned. It was, as Tom had suggested, barely edible. The meat was overcooked to the point of toughness. The vegetables had dissolved into mush, and the whole thing had a burned taste that no amount of salt could disguise. Arabella ate it anyway because she was hungry, but her mind was already working through what she could make with the supplies she had glimpsed in the larder. By the time Vincent returned, she had cleaned the pot and was examining the sacks of flour, cornmeal, beans, and dried goods that comprised his pantry. He came through the door accompanied by the rich scents of horse and leather and sun-warmed earth. "Find everything you need?" he asked, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "I found evidence that you have been slowly poisoning yourself with terrible cooking," Arabella said before she could stop herself, then immediately regretted her boldness. She was supposed to be a servant here, not an equal with the right to criticize. But Vincent laughed, a rich sound that transformed his serious face into something younger and more approachable. "Tom says the same thing at least once a week. I told you I cannot cook worth a damn." "Cannot or never learned how?" Arabella asked. "Maybe both." Vincent pulled out one of the chairs and sat down, studying her with those unusual green eyes. "So when do we start?" "Start what?" "The teaching. I figure there is still an hour of good light left. Might as well begin now." Arabella felt a flutter of something that might have been excitement in her chest. She had loved teaching the neighbor children back home, had felt a sense of purpose in watching understanding dawn on their faces as letters transformed into words and words into meaning. "You have any paper?" "A slate, chalk?" she asked. Vincent shook his head. "I have some paper I use for tallying cattle, but not much. No slate." "We can make do," Arabella said, her mind already working through the problem. "Do you have charcoal from the fire?" "We can write on smooth boards until we figure out something better." For the next hour, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple beyond the windows, Arabella introduced Vincent to the alphabet. She drew the letters in charcoal on a planed board Tom found in the barn, pronouncing each one clearly, and having Vincent repeat them back to her. He was an attentive student, his brow furrowed in concentration, his voice careful as he formed the unfamiliar sounds. He already knew some letters, she discovered, the ones he had picked up through necessity and observation. But there were gaps in his knowledge, and the way the letters combined to form words was still largely a mystery to him. Arabella found herself slipping into the role of teacher naturally, patient and encouraging, adjusting her approach when she saw confusion cloud his face. "That is enough for tonight," she finally said when the light grew too dim to see the board clearly. "You did well. We will practice again tomorrow." Vincent stretched, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension of sitting still for so long. "My head feels full," he admitted, "but in a good way. Thank you, Miss Vance." "Arabella," she corrected. "If we are going to be living under the same roof for 5 years, we might as well use given names." "Arabella," Vincent repeated, and the way he said it with careful attention to each syllable made it sound almost musical. "Then you must call me Vincent, or Vince as Tom does." "Vincent," she said, testing the name on her tongue. "Very well." That night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her, Arabella felt cautiously hopeful for the first time in months. The situation was strange and uncertain, but Vincent seemed to be an honorable man, and there was something deeply satisfying about the prospect of teaching again, of using the education that had cost her so much. The days fell into a rhythm more quickly than Arabella had anticipated. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, learning to make the hearty meals that ranch work required. Thick slabs of bacon, eggs, biscuits with gravy, strong coffee that could wake the dead. Tom and Vincent praised her cooking lavishly, and she took a quiet pride in providing them with food that was both nourishing and palatable. During the day, while Vincent and Tom worked with the cattle or mended fences or handled the 1,000 tasks that kept a ranch running. Arabella threw herself into improving the house. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, aired out blankets, and organized the chaos of bachelor living into something approaching order. She found mouse droppings in the pantry and set about eliminating them with a combination of cleanliness and strategically placed traps. She discovered a vegetable garden behind the house that had been neglected and began coaxing it back to life with water and weeding. But the best part of each day came in the evening, when Vincent would wash up and sit down at the table with her for his lessons. Arabella had purchased a proper slate and chalk on Vincent's monthly trip to town, and she used them to teach him not just letters but numbers, showing him how to add and subtract, multiply and divide. Vincent proved to be a quick study when the material was practical, grasping arithmetic easily, when she framed it in terms of cattle and money and supplies. Reading came harder to him, the abstract nature of combining letters into words and words into sentences requiring a different kind of thinking. But he was determined, and Arabella admired his willingness to struggle with something that clearly did not come naturally. "Why is through spelled that way?" Vincent asked one evening in September, frustration evident in his voice. "There are 6 letters but only 3 sounds." "English is a terrible language for spelling," Arabella agreed. "It has borrowed from so many other languages that the rules are inconsistent. You just have to memorize the odd ones." "That seems inefficient," Vincent muttered, but he dutifully wrote the word 10 more times until his hand could form it automatically. As the weeks passed, Arabella found herself looking forward to these lessons more than she had anticipated. There was something intimate about the process of teaching, about sitting close together in the lamplight, their heads bent over the slate, her hand sometimes guiding his to show him how to form a letter properly. She became aware of small details about Vincent. The way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck when it needed cutting, the scar on his left hand from a long-ago encounter with barbed wire, the unconscious competence with which he moved, his body perfectly adapted to the physical demands of ranch life. She noticed, too, the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, his expression thoughtful and perhaps a bit wondering, as though he could not quite figure her out. It made her feel visible in a way she had not felt in years, seen not as a burden or a problem, but as a person worthy of consideration. One evening in October, after a particularly successful lesson in which Vincent had managed to read an entire simple paragraph without help, he leaned back in his chair and regarded her seriously. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. Arabella's heart skipped nervously, but she nodded. "You can ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." Vincent was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "How did you get so educated? Most women in these parts never learn more than basic reading and writing, if that." Arabella looked down at her hands, remembering. "My mother was a teacher before she married my father. He died when I was 6, and she supported us by teaching in various small towns as we moved around. She made sure I learned everything she knew. After she remarried, my stepfather forbade me from attending school, but I kept learning on my own. I would borrow books from anyone who would lend them to me, read by candlelight after everyone else was asleep. My mother encouraged me in secret, even though it caused trouble with her husband." "She sounds like a good woman," Vincent said softly. "She was. When she got sick 3 years ago, I tried to nurse her, but the doctor said it was consumption and there was nothing to be done. Before she died, she made me promise I would never stop learning, never stop using my mind." Arabella's voice caught slightly. "My stepfather blamed me for her death somehow, said I had put ideas in her head that weakened her. After she was gone, he made my life miserable until finally, he decided to be rid of me entirely. Vincent's face had darkened as she spoke, anger flickering in his eyes. That man is a fool and a coward. You should never have been treated that way. Perhaps, Arabella said, but it led me here, which is not the worst place I could have ended up. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in that moment. Some unspoken acknowledgement that this arrangement between them had become more than just a business transaction. Arabella felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away first, suddenly flustered. I should prepare supper, she said, rising quickly. Vincent stood as well. Arabella, I want you to know that I see what you do here. The house has never been so clean, the food has never been so good, and I am learning things I never thought I would understand. You are not just fulfilling your contract, you are making this place a home. The words struck her deeply, warming something inside that had been cold for a very long time. Thank you, she whispered. That means more than you know. As autumn deepened into winter, the bond between them continued to grow in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Vincent began bringing her small gifts from his trips to town. A new book, a packet of seeds for the garden, a length of pretty fabric that she could make into a new dress. She, in turn, made his favorite foods, mended his clothes with careful stitches, and took pride in his progress as he graduated from simple primers to more complex texts. On a cold December evening, Vincent read aloud to her for the first time from one of her beloved books, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman. His voice was halting at first, stumbling over unfamiliar words, but as he gained confidence, the words began to flow with increasing smoothness. When he finished the poem, he looked up at her with such joy and pride that Arabella felt tears prick her eyes. I did it, he said, almost disbelieving. I read real poetry. You did, Arabella confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. You did it beautifully. Vincent set the book down carefully and reached across the table to take her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with surprising gentleness. I could not have done this without you. You have given me something I thought was lost forever. Arabella looked down at their joined hands, her heart pounding. When had this stopped being simply a matter of fulfilling a contract? When had she started caring about this quiet, determined man who had bought her freedom from a terrible situation and asked only for knowledge in return? Vincent, she began, not sure what she wanted to say. He seemed to understand her confusion because he squeezed her hand once and then released it. I know this situation is complicated. You are here because you had no other choice, and I have no right to expect anything from you beyond what was agreed. But I want you to know that somewhere along the way, you stopped being just a teacher or a housekeeper to me. You have become important. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and uncertainty. Arabella's mind raced. She had grown to care for Vincent, to look forward to his presence, to feel a flutter in her chest when he smiled at her. But she was still bound by a contract, still technically obligated to remain for 5 years regardless of her feelings. And what if she was misreading the situation? What if Vincent simply valued her as a helpful presence in his home and nothing more? You have become important to me as well, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I do not know what that means or where it can lead. Neither do I, Vincent admitted, but maybe we can figure it out together in our own time. It was not a declaration of love, not a proposal or even a clear statement of romantic intent. But it was honest and real, and it opened a door between them that had been slowly unlocking over the past months. Arabella felt some of her anxiety ease. There was no rush, no pressure. They had time to let whatever this was develop naturally. Christmas came, and Arabella decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbon, filling the rooms with the scent of cinnamon and cloves as she baked pies and cookies. Vincent and Tom brought in a small tree, and they spent an evening stringing popcorn and paper chains to hang on its branches. It was the most festive holiday Arabella had experienced in years, made warmer by the presence of people who genuinely seemed to enjoy her company. On Christmas morning, Vincent gave her a gift wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal and a set of fine pencils. "For your writing," he said, looking almost shy. "Tom mentioned once that you keep notes about the garden and recipes, and I thought you might like something nice to write in." Arabella ran her fingers over the smooth leather, touched beyond words. "It is perfect, thank you." She had made him a gift as well, a wool scarf she had knitted from yarn purchased with the small allowance Vincent had insisted on giving her each month despite the terms of her contract. He wound it around his neck immediately, his smile bright and genuine. "I will wear it every day," he promised. The winter passed in a cocoon of growing intimacy and affection. They sat closer together during the evening lessons now, and sometimes their hands would brush as they reached for the same book or slate. Vincent began touching her more freely, a hand on her shoulder as he passed behind her chair, his fingers lingering at the small of her back when he helped her with her coat. The touches were never improper, always respectful, but they carried a charge that made Arabella's skin tingle with awareness. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments during the day, wondering what he was doing out on the range, whether he was warm enough, whether he was being careful. At night, lying alone in her bed, she imagined what it might be like if things were different, if she were truly free to choose her own path, if Vincent might choose her in return. Spring arrived with a rush of green and a sky full of birds returning from their southern migrations. Arabella's garden burst into life, and she spent hours tending it, coaxing vegetables and herbs from the rich soil. Vincent would sometimes join her in the evenings after work, helping with the heavier tasks of hauling water or building trellises for the climbing plants. One such evening in April, as they worked side by side in the fading light, Vincent spoke without preamble. "Your contract has a little more than 3 years left on it." Arabella's hand stilled in the dirt. "Yes, that is right. I have been thinking," Vincent continued, his voice careful, "about what happens when those 3 years are up, whether you will want to leave to go somewhere else and start a new life." "I have thought about it too," Arabella admitted, "though I confess I find it hard to imagine being anywhere else now. This place has become home in a way nowhere else ever has." Vincent set down the fence post he had been holding and turned to face her fully. "What if you did not have to wait 3 more years? What if I released you from the contract now?" Arabella's heart began to race. "Why would you do that?" "Because I do not want you here out of obligation," Vincent said, his green eyes intense. "I want you here because you choose to be here, and if you are going to leave anyway in 3 years, I would rather know now so I can start preparing myself for it. And if I choose to stay?" Arabella asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Then I would ask if you might consider staying not as someone fulfilling a contract, but as my wife." The words seemed to echo in the quiet evening air, momentous and life-changing. Arabella stared at him, her mind spinning. Marriage to Vincent. It was something she had allowed herself to dream about but never truly believed could happen. "Vincent," she breathed. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the hope and fear warring in his expression. "I know I am not educated like you are, that I am just a rancher with dirt under his nails and few prospects beyond this small spread. But I love you, Arabella. I think I have loved you since the first time you corrected my letter formation and did not make me feel stupid for needing the help. You are brilliant and strong and kind, and every day with you is better than the last. If you will have me, I swear I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." Tears spilled down Arabella's cheeks, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness so intense it almost hurt. "You are not just a rancher," she said fiercely. "You are the man who saved me from a terrible fate. You are the man who saw value in my education when everyone else saw only a problem to be solved. You are the man who works hard and treats his animals with kindness and pushes himself to learn even when it is difficult. You are everything good and honest, and I love you too. So much that sometimes I ache with it." Vincent's face transformed, joy breaking across it like sunrise. He reached for her, his hands cradling her face with such tenderness that Arabella felt her heart might burst. "Is that a yes?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Arabella laughed through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of promise, and Arabella wound her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vincent pressed his forehead to hers. "I will make you happy," he vowed. "I swear it." "You already do," Arabella told him. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Yuma, with Tom Fletcher standing as witness and beaming like a proud father. Arabella wore a new dress made from the fabric Vincent had given her, altered and trimmed with lace she had splurged on from her small savings. Vincent wore his best clothes and the scarf she had knitted him, despite the warm weather, because he said he wanted to carry something of her next to his heart. The justice of the peace pronounced them man and wife, and when Vincent kissed her, Arabella felt as though her life was finally, truly beginning. All the hardship and pain of the past had led to this moment, to this man, to this future that stretched before them bright with possibility. They spent their wedding night at a small hotel in Yuma, and Vincent was gentle and patient, taking his time to make sure Arabella felt safe and cherished. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the lamplight, Arabella traced the lines of his face with her fingertips. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Vincent asked, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "For seeing me when I was invisible, for valuing what everyone else dismissed, for loving me." "Always," Vincent promised, "for as long as I live." They returned to the ranch the next day, and life continued with a new sweetness layered over the familiar rhythms. Arabella moved her belongings into Vincent's room, their room now, and took joy in the simple intimacy of sharing a space with someone she loved. They still had their evening lessons, though now they often devolved into stolen kisses and laughter, as Vincent would claim he needed a reward for every word spelled correctly. The ranch prospered under their combined care. Arabella's organizational skills and Vincent's hard work proved to be a formidable combination. She took over the account books and discovered ways to save money and maximize profit. She corresponded with buyers in larger towns, her eloquent letters securing better prices for their cattle than Vincent had ever managed with his halting written attempts. He, in turn, expanded the herd and improved the breeding stock, always consulting with her about major decisions. Tom Fletcher observed their partnership with satisfaction. "You two fit together like puzzle pieces," he remarked one evening at supper. "Like you were made for each other." Arabella and Vincent exchanged a glance across the table, their hands finding each other beneath it. "Maybe we were," Vincent said. That summer, Arabella discovered she was expecting a child. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had never been around babies much, had no mother to guide her through pregnancy and birth. But Vincent's excitement was infectious, and his determination to take care of her made her fears seem smaller. "We will figure it out together," he assured her, his hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "Just like we have figured out everything else." As her body changed and grew, Vincent treated her like she was made of spun glass, constantly trying to prevent her from doing anything strenuous. Arabella bore his hovering with amused patience, though she drew the line when he suggested she stop teaching him his lessons. "I am pregnant, not incapacitated," she told him firmly, "and you still need to work on your cursive." Vincent laughed and resumed his seat at the table, shaking his head. "You are going to be a fierce mother. Someone has to balance out your tendency to spoil this child," Arabella retorted. But she was smiling. On a cold January morning in 1884, Arabella went into labor. A midwife from a neighboring ranch had agreed to attend, and she arrived just as the contractions began intensifying. Vincent was banished from the bedroom, sent to pace the main room with Tom while Arabella labored through the long hours of bringing new life into the world. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, painful and exhausting and frightening. But when she finally heard the thin wail of her baby and the midwife announced, "It is a boy, a healthy boy," Arabella felt a rush of love so powerful it eclipsed everything else. They laid the baby on her chest, and she marveled at his tiny perfection, his miniature fingers and rosebud mouth, his eyes that were already trying to focus on her face. Vincent was allowed in then, and he approached the bed with wondering steps, his eyes wide and damp with emotion. "A son," he breathed, reaching out a tentative hand to touch the baby's downy head. "We have a son." "What should we name him?" Arabella asked, exhausted but happy. Vincent thought for a moment. "What about Samuel, after my father?" "Samuel Foster," Arabella tested the name. "I like it." "Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world." The baby made a small sound, and Vincent let out a choked laugh that was half sob. "I never thought I would have this. A family. A real family." "You have it now," Arabella said, reaching for his hand. "We have it." Vincent bent to kiss her forehead, then pressed a gentle kiss to Samuel's head. "I love you both so much. I will do everything in my power to give you both a good life." "I know you will," Arabella said with absolute certainty. The early months with Samuel were challenging. He was a healthy baby but demanded constant attention, and Arabella quickly learned that no amount of reading about childcare could truly prepare you for the reality of a squalling infant who would not sleep. Vincent helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Samuel in the evenings when Arabella was too exhausted to move, changing diapers with fumbling but earnest care, singing off key lullabies that somehow soothed the baby even if they were tonally questionable. Tom proved to be surprisingly useful as well, revealing that he had helped raise his younger siblings and knew all sorts of tricks for settling a fussy baby. The three of them formed an unlikely but effective team, keeping the household running and the ranch operational even with the demands of a newborn. As Samuel grew from infant to baby to toddler, Arabella watched Vincent blossom as a father. He was patient and playful, teaching Samuel to walk by holding his chubby hands, reading simple stories to him even when the boy was too young to understand, carrying him on his shoulders around the ranch and naming all the animals. The love between father and son was palpable, and it made Arabella fall even more deeply in love with her husband. Vincent's education continued as well, though the lessons were often interrupted now by Samuel's needs. He had progressed to reading complex texts with relative ease, and he had begun writing letters to various ranchers and merchants on his own, his handwriting improving steadily with practice. More than once, Arabella found him reading one of her books by lamplight after she had gone to bed, his expression intent and focused. "You have created a monster," he joked one night when she discovered him engrossed in a novel well past midnight. "I cannot stop." There are so many books I want to read now." "That is not a monster," Arabella said, kissing the top of his head. "That is exactly what I hoped would happen." When Samuel was 2 years old, Arabella found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and she was able to continue most of her normal activities until the very end. Their daughter was born on a warm September evening, arriving quickly and with less drama than her brother. They named her Clara, after Arabella's mother, and she had her father's green eyes and her mother's dark hair. Vincent was absolutely besotted with his daughter, and Arabella often found him simply staring at the baby with an expression of wonder, as though he could not quite believe she was real. Samuel was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything and constantly trying to make her smile. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Word spread about Vincent's quality cattle and fair dealings, and buyers began seeking him out rather than the other way around. Arabella's careful management of their finances meant they were able to save money, to make improvements to the property, to hire additional help during the busy seasons. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, they were happy. On a spring evening in 1887, with Samuel playing in the yard and baby Clara sleeping in her cradle, Arabella and Vincent sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Vincent had his arm around her shoulders and Arabella leaned into his warmth, feeling content in a way that once would have seemed impossible. "Do you ever think about that day in Yuma?" Vincent asked quietly. "When I bought your contract, sometimes," Arabella admitted. "It seems like a lifetime ago now, like it happened to different people." "In a way it did," Vincent said. "I was just a lonely rancher who could barely write his own name. You were a woman who had been treated terribly and had every reason to be bitter and closed off. Look at us now." Arabella turned to look at him, this man who had changed the entire trajectory of her life. "You saved me that day, not just from my stepfather but from a future that would have crushed my spirit. You gave me a chance to be myself, to use my education, to be valued for who I am. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Vincent's hand came up to cup her cheek. "You saved me too. You opened up a whole world I did not know existed. Every time I read a book or write a letter or teach Samuel his letters, I think about how you gave me that. You made me believe I was worth more than I thought I was." "You were always worth more," Arabella said fiercely. "You just needed someone to show you." They kissed as the sun sank below the horizon. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate hardships. The years continued to pass in a blur of work and love and laughter. Samuel grew into a bright, curious boy who loved books as much as his mother and horses as much as his father. Clara was a spirited child who was afraid of nothing and kept everyone on their toes with her adventurous nature. In 1890, they welcomed another son, whom they named Thomas after Tom Fletcher, who had become like family to them. Tom the elder pretended to be gruff about the honor but was clearly moved, and he doted on his namesake shamelessly. The ranch expanded to include more land purchased from a retiring neighbor, and Vincent hired 2 more permanent hands to help manage the increased workload. Arabella continued to handle the business side of things, her sharp mind and excellent correspondence skills making her invaluable. She also began teaching the ranch children, both their own and those of the workers, holding informal lessons in the main room several days a week. It brought her joy to see young minds opening to the world of words and numbers, to know she was passing on the gift of education that her own mother had given her. Vincent never stopped learning. He read voraciously, everything from agricultural journals to literature to history. making up for all the years of lost opportunity. He and Arabella would discuss what they read in the evenings, their conversations ranging from practical matters of ranch management to philosophical questions about the nature of progress and civilization. It was the kind of intellectual partnership Arabella had never dreamed she would find, and she treasured it deeply. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1894, Vincent surprised her with a trip to San Francisco. Tom agreed to watch the children and the ranch for a week, and they took the train west, marveling at the speed of travel and the changing landscape outside the windows. The city was a revelation, bustling and modern and full of wonders. They visited museums and theaters, dined in restaurants with white tablecloths and multiple courses, walked along the waterfront hand in hand like young sweethearts. On their last night in the city, as they stood on the balcony of their hotel room looking out over the glittering lights, Vincent pulled Arabella close and kissed her temple. "Thank you for 10 incredible years," he said softly, "for 3 beautiful children, for every lesson and every meal and every moment of partnership. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Arabella turned in his arms, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "We have built something remarkable together, haven't we, from such an unpromising beginning?" "The best things often come from unlikely places," Vincent said. "That day in Yuma, I had no idea I was not just buying someone's labor but meeting the love of my life. If I could go back and tell my younger self what was waiting for him, I do not think he would believe it." "I would not have believed it either," Arabella confessed. "I thought my life was over, that I would spend years in servitude to some cruel master and emerge broken and empty. Instead, I found you. I found home. I found purpose and love and a future worth living." They made love that night with a tenderness born of years of intimacy and affection, and when they returned to the ranch, they both agreed that wonderful as the trip had been, there was nowhere they would rather be than their own land with their own children. The turn of the century brought changes to the Arizona Territory. The railroad expanded, bringing new opportunities and new challenges. The old ways of ranching were giving way to more modern methods, and Vincent worked to keep their operation competitive without losing the values that had always guided him. Arabella helped research new techniques, corresponding with agricultural experts, and reading every journal she could find on animal husbandry and land management. Samuel, now a young man of 16 in 1900, showed every sign of wanting to follow in his father's footsteps. He had his father's way with horses and his mother's head for business, a combination that promised well for the future of the ranch. Clara, at 13, was torn between her love of the ranch and a growing interest in medicine, inspired by the lady doctor who had recently moved to Yuma. Young Thomas, at 10, was still figuring out his path, but showed a talent for mechanics, and was endlessly fascinated by the few automobiles that had begun appearing in the territory. On a warm June evening, the entire family gathered on the porch after supper, a tradition they had maintained for years. Vincent and Arabella sat in the chairs they had occupied for nearly 2 decades, their hands clasped between them. The children sprawled on the steps, talking and joking with the easy affection of siblings who genuinely liked each other. "Tell us again how you met," Clara asked, a request that had become ritual over the years. Vincent and Arabella exchanged a glance, and he squeezed her hand. "Your mother was standing on an auction block in the blazing sun, being sold like property because she had committed the crime of being too smart," he began. "And your father was a cowboy who could barely read, but had the courage to spend everything he had to give a stranger a chance," Arabella continued. "And then what happened?" Thomas asked, even though he knew the story by heart. Then I asked her to teach me everything she knew, Vincent said, smiling at his wife. And she did. She taught me to read and write, to see myself as someone capable of learning and growing. But more than that, she taught me what it means to truly love someone, to be partners in every sense of the word. And your father taught me that education is not just about books, Arabella added. He taught me about the land and the animals, about hard work and integrity, about building a life with your hands and your heart. He showed me that being valued for who you are is the greatest gift anyone can give. It is a good story, Samuel said. I hope I find someone to build a life with the way you two have. You will, Vincent assured him. When the time is right and with the right person, you will. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the children eventually drifted off to their respective rooms, leaving Vincent and Arabella alone on the porch. The night was warm and still, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant call of a coyote. You ever regret it? Arabella asked suddenly. Spending so much on my contract that day. Vincent turned to her, his green eyes serious in the lamplight. Not for a single second. It was the best investment I ever made. $100 in exchange for a lifetime of love and partnership. I would pay 10 times that and count myself lucky. I used to lie awake at night terrified of what would become of me, Arabella confessed. Sold to a stranger, bound to serve him for 5 years, with no idea what kind of man he might be. And then you asked me to teach you, and you were kind, and you treated me like a person instead of property, and slowly everything changed. We changed each other, Vincent said. That is what love does. It transforms us into better versions of ourselves. Arabella stood and moved to sit on Vincent's lap, something she had not done in years, and he wrapped his arms around her with a chuckle. We are too old for this, he protested, but he was smiling. Speak for yourself, Arabella retorted. I am in my prime. Vincent laughed and pulled her close, resting his cheek against her hair. They sat like that for a long time, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded anything either of them had dared to dream. In the years that followed, they watched their children grow and begin to forge their own paths. Samuel took on more and more responsibility for the ranch, proving himself to be a capable and innovative manager. Clara went east to study medicine, her letters full of excitement about her studies and her determination to return to Arizona and serve the communities that needed doctors. Thomas developed a mechanical genius that led him to work with the new agricultural equipment revolutionizing farming and ranching. Vincent and Arabella grew older together with grace, their love deepening with each passing year. Vincent's hair turned silver, and Arabella's dark hair acquired threads of gray, but they still sat together each evening, reading and talking and simply enjoying each other's presence. Vincent still learned new things, his curiosity undiminished by age, and Arabella still taught, both him and anyone else who wanted to learn. Tom Fletcher eventually retired, moving into a small cottage on the property that Vincent and Arabella built for him, but he remained a vital part of their lives, a beloved uncle to the children and a trusted friend to both of them. In 1910, Arizona was on the cusp of statehood, and the territory was changing rapidly. Vincent and Arabella's ranch had become one of the most successful in the region, known for quality stock and ethical practices. They had hired numerous workers over the years, many of whom stayed for decades, drawn by fair wages and respectful treatment. On an autumn day that year, Vincent and Arabella rode out together to a hill that overlooked their land. It was something they tried to do regularly, taking time away from the demands of work and family to simply be together. They dismounted and stood looking out over the valley, at the cattle grazing peacefully, the house and barns they had built and maintained, the gardens and corrals and fences that represented decades of labor. "I sometimes think about that scared girl on the auction block," Arabella said quietly. "And I wonder what she would think if she could see this, see what her life became." "I think she would be proud," Vincent said, his arm around her shoulders. "Proud of her courage in surviving a terrible situation. Proud of what she built from nothing." "We built it together," Arabella corrected. "I could not have done any of this without you." "We are a team," Vincent agreed. "Always have been, always will be." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. After nearly 30 years of marriage, they could communicate without words, understanding each other on a level that went beyond language. "You remember that first lesson?" Arabella asked. "When I taught you the alphabet with charcoal on a board?" "I remember thinking you were the most patient teacher in the world not to laugh at a grown man struggling with letters," Vincent said. "And I remember the way your face lit up when I got something right, like my success genuinely mattered to you." "It did matter," Arabella said. "It still does. Every accomplishment of yours is precious to me." "And every moment with you is precious to me," Vincent replied. "I bought your contract thinking I would get a teacher and a housekeeper. Instead, I got a partner, a lover, a best friend, the mother of my children, and the love of my life. It was the greatest bargain ever struck." Arabella laughed, the sound rich and full of joy. "Trust you to think of our marriage as a business deal." "The best business deal ever made," Vincent insisted, pulling her close and kissing her soundly. They rode back to the house as dusk fell, their horses moving side by side just as they had moved through life for 3 decades. The lights of home beckoned in the gathering darkness, and they could see figures moving inside. Their children and grandchildren gathered for Sunday supper, a tradition that had continued even as the family expanded. As they entered the warm, lamp-lit house filled with the people they loved most in the world, Arabella reflected on the strange and winding path that had brought her here. She had been sold for being too educated, treated as a burden rather than a blessing. And then a cowboy with green eyes and a generous heart had said, "Teach me everything you know," and in doing so, had given her back her life and her sense of worth. She had taught him to read and write and calculate. But he had taught her something equally valuable. That love could be found in the most unexpected places, that partnership was built through mutual respect and shared effort, and that a life well lived was measured not in wealth or status but in the bonds forged with others, and the legacy left behind. That night, after the guests had gone home and the children were settled, Vincent and Arabella prepared for bed with the comfortable routine of long marriage. As they lay together in the darkness, Arabella's head on Vincent's shoulder and his arm around her, she felt profoundly grateful for the twists of fate that had brought them together. "I love you," she whispered into the quiet night. "I love you too," Vincent replied, his voice drowsy but sincere. "Every single day, I love you more." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, two souls who had found their perfect match in the vast and unforgiving landscape of the Wild West. Their story had begun with an auction and a desperate gamble, but it had become something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of seeing value in another person, and choosing to build a life together based on respect, affection, and unwavering commitment. The ranch would eventually pass to Samuel, who would run it with the same integrity his father had shown. Clara would return from medical school and establish a practice in Yuma, providing care to people who had never had access to a good doctor. Thomas would become an engineer, designing equipment that would revolutionize ranching throughout the Southwest. and all of them would carry forward the lessons their parents had taught them. That education was precious, that hard work mattered, that treating people with dignity was not optional, and that love, real and true and deep, was the foundation upon which all good things were built. Vincent and Arabella Foster lived long lives, surrounded by children and grandchildren, respected in their community, secure in the knowledge that they had created something meaningful together. When they were old and gray and still holding hands across the supper table, people would ask them the secret to their successful marriage. "She was sold for being too educated," Vincent would say with a smile. "And I was a cowboy who said, 'Teach me everything you know.' We learned from each other and we never stopped. He saw me when I was invisible," Arabella would add. "He valued what others dismissed, and he loved me not in spite of who I was, but because of it. It was, in the end, a simple story. But like all the best love stories, it was true, and it endured long after the Wild West became history and the 20th century reshaped the land they had loved. Their great-grandchildren would hear the tale and marvel at the courage it took to build a life from such unpromising beginnings. And they would understand that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a heroic quest, but with a small act of kindness, a willingness to learn, and two people deciding that together they were stronger than anything the world could throw at them. The ranch still stands today, a testament to their legacy, and on quiet evenings when the wind blows just right across the Arizona hills, you can almost hear the echo of their voices, reading together by lamplight, teaching and learning, loving and living, proving that even in the hardest places and the hardest times, love can not only survive but flourish beyond imagination.